My name is Lucas Wall, and I am a member of Ann Arbor Rail Club who has helped put on the webinar this morning. I used to do upgrades for the state of Michigan for riders, advancing in category from what's now beginner and novice to Cat 4, Cat 3. That's not something USA Cycling does, but I kind of know about that process. And so if you've got questions about how upgrades go, feel free. I'm always happy to give you some ideas. And then I have a coaching business, Develop Coaching, and I work with individual athletes through that and bike racing, focusing on training plans and how do you get better and things like that. And we decided to do the webinar just as a part of the Ann Arbor Spring Training Series, which I've been involved with for a number of years. And since we couldn't do it in person this year, we thought, why not focus on some of that content in a format so that people can start learning some of these things, start using them. And when we have the opportunity, we'll do the Spring Training Series. There's a slight chance we do something this year, but it'll probably be more likely it'll come back next year. But that's something we've been doing in Ann Arbor for 30 plus years. So, John, how about, who are you and what do you do?
My name is John Samet. I'm part of the Wolverine Sports Club. I'm on the board of the Wolverine Sports Club, and I'm also the manager of the Elite Race Team. That's my part as a racer. I've been racing for 25 plus years now, and I'm also an official. I became an official in 2004, and I'm also on the board of the MBRA, and I'm the director of officials for Michigan.
Awesome, thank you. And Jeff, are you there?
Yeah.
Share with the group who you are. You're new to Michigan, but not new to racing and new to cycling.
I'm originally from Michigan. Actually started racing at Waterford Hills with the Flying Rhino Cycling Club. I actually did mostly mountain biking in my early 20s. Moved to Connecticut and was there, just moved back in August. And in Connecticut, I was a very large part of the junior program out there called CCAP, Connecticut Cycling Advancement Program, getting all the juniors on all the bikes and all the disciplines. And I like helping out, and I coach a little bit, mostly juniors, and I just like getting new people on bikes. It's fun to help. I race road right now with Base Media Racing.
Oh, excellent, excellent. And we're all looking forward to being back out and actually riding our bikes. Well, racing, I guess. Lots of us are out riding already. So, just looking at results of the poll results from people who were here, those should have popped up or be available for you to see. But as expected, most people are coming from Michigan, and kind of a mix of experience in terms of group riding. And then just a few people racing some road and other people doing recreational riding. So we'll keep that in mind as we're talking about things. As we get into presentation here, one of the things that kind of a little bit of the orientation is on road, but lots of these things are applicable other places. So as we're going through this, please take advantage of using the question and answer function. It may be that you've got questions, and obviously it's hard to interrupt on the webinar and ask your questions and things like that. Might actually just go through and make people available to, here, I'm gonna hit allow to talk, and everybody, since we have a small group, I think you all will come in unmuted. Or excuse me, muted. So you don't have to chime in if you don't want to. But if there's a spot and you want to ask a question, feel free to do that. And and also feel free to use the question and answer function, because sometimes we'll go through and we may touch on it as we're talking. And then if we don't, we have a couple spots where we're going to stop and ask for questions, and we can, it'll probably be easiest to keep question and answer feature on the webinar rather than the chat, just so we have things in one place. What we're going to talk about is one way to do things when you're in a group ride. So you may come into a situation and recognize they do things a little bit differently, or as you learn, you may learn there's some other approaches. So this is just one way to go about things. It's kind of conservative in terms of trying to ensure safety. And so I don't think if you do a lot of these basics, you know, sometimes you actually need to revert back to them because you may not know a group. It may be a new setting. And you can get more complicated and advanced later on, but this is just a good kind of starting point. But I want to make sure you understand, you'll hear about other ways to do things. And then related to that is, in general, try not to break the rules. Well, try not to break the rules, the basics of group riding, unless you know why you're doing it. Once you learn why, there are all sorts of exceptions and things like that. But in general, if you say, let me stick to these until I know why I'm doing it differently, that'll serve you well, serve everybody else well. So why beginning racer program? There's a lot of learning to be done with group riding. There's not, you know, we're not geese flying through the sky in a V and somehow they all learn that. It's somewhat innately. And so we do have to learn some of the basics. And it's really kind of an extensive process. So having done some of this, looked at some other learning things, you can see there's both a content side in terms of knowing things, and then there's also the skills side and practicing it. And obviously when we do the clinic in person, we do a lot of the skills practice, but we also essentially do what we're doing today, and we introduce a lot of the basic concepts. So we're not going to get super deep into things because it can get complicated and it takes quite a while. But we're going to start with just helping people be aware of what some of the basics are to riding in a group. What are the expectations for you as you're riding, and what are the expectations you should have of other people? And that really fits into the model, because if you know, this observe piece is you want to be able to recognize what's going on in the group, and that helps keep you safe because you can anticipate, does that person know what they're doing in the group or not knowing what they're doing in the group? Are there safe things going on in the group, or are there some tendencies that maybe aren't as safe? But that'll help you observe what's happening in a group better, help you understand more if you're watching a bike race, what's going on. And then as you get better, you start to recognize things. So I guess what I was really talking about is you're paying attention to what's going on, then you're recognizing, you know, is somebody in the right place, or they're doing the right thing and they're responding the right way. And then through some feedback and practice, you're going to improve. The skills part, we're obviously not going to be able to do today in terms of practicing and doing the skills. But this always takes a long time, because one of the things you need to do with all the skills is actually habituate those. They become habits that you just do every time you're on the bike, every time you're riding with other people. And at some point, as you get more advanced, then you're improvising and taking some of the core things that you know, some of the habits that you've developed, and a new situation arises, and you're able to adapt and adjust and improvise on the fly to how to navigate some sort of scenario. And that takes a lot of practice and experience. So we're really just starting at the beginning. What are the basics? What are the expectations? And go from there. So just real quick outline. What are some of the basics? Position on the bike, we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about protecting your front wheel. That's kind of a core detail of staying safe in any group setting. And then riding predictably. We'll talk about what that looks like, what you should see in others, and what you should be doing for yourself. And then just the perspective on that. And that's kind of a mental and what you're doing on the bike sort of perspective. Couple core simple things. Position on the bike. Head and eyes up. This is a really key one for you in seeing what's going on. I always tell people, look 5 to 10 bikes ahead of you. So if you're in that group, obviously if it's a small group, you may see the whole group. But if you're in a big group, you're looking pretty far ahead. You might not always be able to see through the people in front of you, because you might be right behind somebody, and so you're basically just seeing their backside. But make sure that you are paying attention to what's happening. Is somebody swerving out ahead? Are people moving from one side of the road to the other? that pretty good indication that there's an obstacle or something. And so you're always trying to focus your attention up the road. With practice, you can use your peripheral vision and actually pay attention to that wheel in front of you, so you're obviously not getting too close to the person in front of you. But your focus should really often be much further up the road. If you find I'm looking down, I have my head down, I'm staring at the person in front of you, you're not getting that proper perspective in terms of seeing what's going on in the whole group. So really focus on that heads up, eyes up. And that's also a key thing to look for with other people. If you see somebody ahead of you who's always got their eyes down, you know they're probably not going to be as attentive to something happening in front of them. And so you might have to give them more space, or just be aware that they may let a gap open, or they're not following as the riders move across the road. And so that's always a key signal to watch out for with other people is somebody's head up. Next one is a position on the bike is just to relax flexible shoulders, elbows. And the reason for that is because you're going to hit bumps. And if those bumps happen and your arms are locked out, your shoulders are really stiff, those bumps go straight through your bike up into your body and your whole body will shake. Whereas if you are flexible, you're going to absorb those bumps. As you're going around corners, you absorb any bumps, and so you're going to keep better contact with the pavement going around corners. And then the other thing is, if there's somebody next to you, at some point in group riding, people get bumped. And if you're locked out, if you're really rigid, what happens if somebody bumps you is your whole bike moves, and you're going to sway side to side. Whereas if you are if you're more flexible, that bump happens and your body might move a little bit, but you're not going to pull your whole bike with you when there's some contact. Or so maybe somebody bumps your handlebars, same thing happens. Your bike's going to move a little bit, but you can adjust. And so keeping that relaxed shoulders and elbows is really helpful. Last one, it's somewhat related, is you've got hands in the drops. And that's helpful, helping keep center of balance low. And this is particularly true with racing. But you protect your handlebars. What I'm sharing here is, you got a group of riders, and if one rider moves up and you've got your hands on the drops, they can't get in. And I should zoom in here real close. Is if they've got their hands on the drops, this person in green can't really get in there. Essentially, you're blocking them out. But if you've got your hands up on the tops, they can actually sometimes hook underneath. And then you lock handlebars, and that's almost a certain crash. So that is a thing that we really encourage, especially in race scenarios, is learning and getting comfortable riding in the drops. And sometimes that requires bike fit and some other things to do that and just practice. But part of it all is just knowing that can be a safety thing, especially when things are really tight and tense. Presentation. So just some basics of how you sit on the bike are going to help you when riding in the group. Next kind of key detail for riding safely in the group is protecting your front wheel. And the easiest way to think about this is just there's a bubble around your handlebars and front wheel. You want to keep that area clear, safe, unobstructed, able to move, things like that. With that, and one example is protecting your front wheel by not overlapping. So if I'm the rider with the red jersey, I don't want to hang out right here behind the rider in the blue jersey, because essentially what happens is they're getting really close to that danger zone. If they happen to make a move to the left, down in the picture, but that chops my front wheel and I lose. So that person in the front position always has the dominant kind of position in the group. They're in the controlling position. And so it's really my responsibility as the rider in red to back off a little bit and give a little bit of space, so that I can stay safe if there's a sudden movement. They're just moving position, or there's an obstacle in the road or something like that. And so kind of staying out of those situations where something can hit your front wheel, and really always trying to stay a little bit more behind. We'll go back to this screen. That makes things a lot easier in terms of staying safe. Now, if you're going to pass, people often ask about if you're going to pass. You're obviously going to move through this zone, but you're continuing to move. And so that's a lot different situation than if you are hanging out right here And then there's a lot of time where suddenly somebody might make a move, and that's what we're trying to avoid. So if you need to sweep through, that's fine. But we don't want to be hanging out in that kind of the danger zone. So key thing is protecting your front wheel. If there's one thing that you take away from riding in a group, this is one of the key ones. Because lots of other things can be navigated. Lots of other things can be avoided if you are not overlapping wheels. Some of the most catastrophic things don't happen. John, Jeff, any thoughts on some of those key basics in terms of sitting on the bike and protecting your front wheel?
Definitely be watching what's going on, like keeping your head up, especially if you're riding behind somebody. If you kind of know what's going on ahead of you, you're not going to fall into that giant hole in the asphalt that we seem to have a lot of out here in Michigan. And,
Yeah.
and also another word for half wheel, or for being in the wheel is half wheeling somebody. You might hear that. Please stop half wheeling, or get out of my back pocket. Those are other words that I've heard people say to, so you know what's going on. You know, that's not all secret codes.
Yeah, and it is helpful. And I was just going to the next slide, and we talk about communicating, and some of those things. It's helpful to know what people mean by those, because that's, they're trying to tell you stay safe. Because the other thing is that person in front, they sometimes, if there's contact, they might crash, but more often it's going to be you who's following. And it's really the responsibility of the person behind to stay safe. Although at the same time, we're always cognizant of who's around us. We're not trying to hit people, but if you're the person behind and somebody's saying, get out of my back pocket, they're really trying to keep you safe. So always keep in mind, it's always your responsibility protecting that front wheel. Other people are probably going to look out for you, and you do need to look out for each other in the group to stay safe. But ultimately, front wheel is always your responsibility to make sure you're keeping that safe.
I think you've covered it pretty well. I want to really emphasize the point about keeping the upper body relaxed, because that's very important. You say that you put it as if you hit a bump, or if somebody bumps you, that it transfers through to you and it affects your body. But what happens more is, if you're rigid, you're more likely to flinch when you hit a bump or somebody touches you. If you ever go up behind a cat or something and you touch them when they're not looking, all of a sudden they jump 3 feet in the air. Well, you kind of have the same reaction, and you might flinch. Well, when you flinch like that, you might run into somebody else, or you might hit something wrong, and it could cause a crash, or it could cause somebody else to crash. So keeping that upper body nice and relaxed is very, very important. So you can, like you described, Lucas, you can absorb things as opposed to flinching from them.
And that fits in perfectly with being predictable on the bike, which just happens to be the slide we're now looking at. And talking about slow movements and adjustments. There are going to be things that happen on the bike that are sudden and you need to react to. At the same time, you don't want to overreact. One of the big mistakes in responding to any sort of thing on the bike is typically overreacting. And so, by looking up the road, by anticipating a lot of things, by staying relaxed in your body, we tend to be able to anticipate better and then react a little bit more smoothly, which doesn't cause a ripple effect with other people and cause crashes and things like that. So slow movements and adjustments, obviously in a group, people are going to be moving here and there, but you always want to do that in a slow way so that others can kind of anticipate and flow with you. And so slow movements and adjustments, following a line and communicating are things we're going to touch on right now. So when we think about moving on a bike, lots of times we might think about just side to side. But when you're riding with a group, there's a lot of how you move forward and backward relative to other people. So kind of think about all of those directions as when you're riding in a group. You don't want to make sudden movements to the side. You want to make those kind of slow and steady. Sometimes we'll use hand signals to communicate those. Sometimes we say, you know, moving over, changing lines, but you communicate, make that smooth, make it so it's not a surprise to other people. Similarly, you don't want to slow down real quickly. When you're riding in a group, brakes are generally not our friends. The less you can use your brakes, the better. Some people say don't use your brakes at all. I think most of us also recognize that there's a degree to which you have to use your brakes. But the less brakes that you use, the less suddenly you apply them, all those things, the smoother it is, the more reaction time you give people behind you. And part of that is, and we'll keep revisiting this because it's really important, is seeing up the road, anticipating, keeping that vision up the road, not just the person in front of you. And that way you can sometimes just stop pedaling and you'll ease off just enough to react to whatever might be coming. Whereas if you're looking at that rider right in front of you, suddenly it becomes an urgent, like trying not to crash sort of scenario. And then you end up having to grab a handful of brakes, try not to hit somebody, which causes a chain reaction behind you a lot faster. So some of these things play together to make it nice and smooth. Similarly, when you're trying to ride smoothly in a group and have people follow you and draft you, you don't want to accelerate real hard. So there's definitely this element of you don't want to do anything too fast moving forward or accelerating. You don't want to slam on your brakes and move backward relative to other riders too quickly. And that right and left movement, you want to keep smooth and predictable. Next thing is, in terms of being predictable, we talk about riding a line or holding a line. And some people think about that as just riding down a line on the road. And that is actually a good skill in terms of learning, can I ride in a really straight line down the road and see how long you can ride that white line or something like that. But that's not really what we mean by holding a line. We really mean following the rider in front of you. When we're doing group riding, it's all in relation to the people who you're riding with. And so lots of times, especially if you're just out recreational or doing a group ride, that's simply just follow the path of the rider in front of you. And that might be parallel to one of the roads in the line. And again, kind of seems a little bit intuitive. But in this scenario, this is a straight line. Everyone is following the path of the rider in front of them, and everybody's holding a line. Nobody's veering off to one side or another. And while there's a change in the position on the road, maybe they're setting up to come around a corner ahead or something like that, everybody's actually following a very predictable path. And so that counts as holding a line as well. And we'll talk about pace lines in a minute and how that varies a little bit as you're on a pace line. But make sure to communicate. In terms of being predictable, it's super easy to predict if somebody's already told you what's going to happen. So feel free to talk. I know in some circles within cycling, people will be like, oh, you shouldn't have to talk. Well, maybe at the pro level, in certain situations, there's not as much talking, but they do actually talk. If you ever watch some of those things, they're talking as they're going. You know, Cat 2, Cat 3, people are working together out there. They're often encouraging each other and talking. So you know, the sometimes mischaracterization of not talking isn't really true. As you get better and better and you ride with people more who have experience and you're comfortable with each other, there may be less that you have to say because they just become habits and norms of how you ride together. But if there's somebody new to the group, that probably means you have to start communicating with them until you assess, you know, do they know what to anticipate, things like that. So definitely talk. Hand signals are simple things to just let everybody know, hey, we're slowing down or whatever. And then the picture of the person with the black jersey is giving a little elbow wiggle. We'll talk about that in a minute. But that's a signal when you're pacelining about who's pulling through and what that rider is doing, because they're going to change lines and they're telling you, hey, I'm changing lines. So we'll revisit that shortly. And then perspective is a little bit of an abstract concept, but what we want you to do is mentally focus on when you're riding in a group, being assertive, not passive, not just letting anything happen around you. You know, somebody's doing something. At the same time, not being aggressive, not forcing, I'm going to be in this spot. I have to take that spot. And like I said, there are exceptions to these rules. If everybody's professional and it's a race and it's the last couple laps, you're going to see some aggressive things going on. But as we're learning, as we're doing some of those things, we want to make sure focus on being assertive. Don't just let anything go that's happening around you. Next week, we'll get into a little bit more how do we control the space around us in a group. And so we'll talk about how to be assertive in those situations. But keep that in mind, assertive, not passive, not just kind of letting everything pass you by, or aggressive and kind of forcing things to happen. Also keep in mind that when you're riding with a group, it's a group activity, and kind of you live and die together, and that can be literal or just figurative. So what you're doing and what others are doing are going to affect each other, and keep that in mind for safety, for just riding smoothly, and all those things. And then also keep in mind, it is a long process of learning, practicing, and improving. I've been racing bikes for more than 30 years and coaching for more than 10, and I'm continuing to learn things all the time. So this is not something you're going to be an expert at overnight. It also doesn't take 30 years. I'm not that slow of a learner, but there are just lots of details, nuances that you can pick up as you go. So just if you keep that in mind, that I'm always trying to learn and practice and improve, that'll help out quite a bit. Now, as we get into learning to paceline, this is kind of an overly organized but large group riding down the road. And but all the basics that we've talked about so far, your position on your bike, focusing on how to protect your front wheel, being predictable, and keeping kind of perspective of, what am I doing? Why am I here? How does that fit in with everybody? Are all going to help you in that big group scenario. But we don't start with the big field. We'll get more to that next week. But one of the basics of riding together and applying these things is just riding in a pace line. So position on the bike is important, and big one is always just looking ahead and anticipating things. You always want to protect your front wheel by not overlapping. The pace is not always super steady. And so zoom this out to our group. If one person's speeding up, you get this gap, and the next person speeds up and somebody else rolls up, and then your pace is a little off. Anyway, you can do this bunch up, kind of bungee cord effect. And but in the process, somebody rolls up, they don't want to be hanging out here very long, because then suddenly, maybe that person also is coming up, and so they pull out to the side to scrub speed, and now you've got a situation where maybe people are hitting wheels. So even if it's a single line, you have to be mindful of protecting your front wheel. Some other basics of riding in a group is just pacing. So rider on front has a responsibility to try and keep that pace nice and smooth. And that way, if they're accelerating, you start getting these big gaps that can open up. That makes it harder for everybody else to follow in behind. And so what we really want to do is keep it real smooth so that the spacing in between riders can be steady. And one of the ways that we're predictable and smooth and work together well is keeping this gap between riders pretty steady. Some people are really comfortable riding close, and that takes practice. Sometimes you can get 12 inches. It can be a real effective distance in terms of drafting, but also give you just a little bit of padding when you're in a group. Most people, as you're getting started, aren't going to be comfortable riding quite that close. I always say try to aim for about a wheel's length, which is a little over 2 feet, 2.5 feet, and that's a great target. But at least a bike length. And if you find that you're more than a bike length behind people, it's just a matter of getting practice, being comfortable. And that's going to come through the people around you being predictable, looking for some signals within them. Are they predictable in terms of riding smoothly? We did talk about this rider in red, talk about a line being just following somebody down the road. But if this person in front of you they sort of are following everybody. Maybe we jump back here. This rider in purple is, unpredictable. They're sort of following everybody, but they keep moving to the side and they're a little wobbly and they speed up and they slow down. That's not going to give these two riders back here any confidence at all, and they might be wanting to back off. So sometimes we'll say somebody's not steady or somebody's not holding their line just because they're unsteady in the group. And so one of the things we can do to ride smoothly together is just being aware of trying to ride nice and smoothly, holding a line so that the other people behind you are confident in your skills. And then the other thing that happens is, you're all in this together, and part of that is riding smooth, but, maybe a gap opens up and, who knows what happened. But instead of this rider sprinting across the gap, maybe this rider does it real slowly, and in the process, the other two riders behind can keep up, and there's not new gaps that form. So they do it nice and smoothly, and it's a slower process, but then the whole group comes together. So those are ways to kind of keep some of those basics in mind. As we jump back to the presentation here, a little bit more formally. So when you're in a pace line, and we're going to go through an example of this in just a minute with John and Jeff, but when you're in one of the back positions, I just talked about this, but pretty much you're just following. You're not really doing too much. You want to keep your spacing smooth. You want to keep your speed smooth. You don't want to be wobbly, but you're just following. So this front person has some responsibilities, though. One of the key ones is just keeping a steady speed. So while they're on the front, goal is really just a nice steady pace. As you're going up a hill, you need to try and keep the effort consistent. The speed might not be exact. But then the trickier one is when you're going down the hill. When you're on the front, you got some work to do because everybody else is getting a draft. They're coming down fast. They might even be touching the brakes just not to roll past you. So when you're on the front on a downhill, you got to ride because everybody else behind you is getting it easy. And then applying this communication thing is you've got to rotate off the front. So earlier I alluded to this elbow wiggle. Here, I'll jump back over here. So our elbow wiggle, you see that. And this is a signal that somebody is pulling off. They don't want you to follow them across the road, but instead they want to change lines. So normally if this person moves over to the side, you're going to get everybody else following across the road too. But if what they're trying to do is pull off the front, they're going to do this little elbow wiggle. In this case, if this person is going to pull to the left, they're going to move their right elbow. And that just says they want everybody else to come by on that side. And so then they're going to pull off smoothly, and that allows these next riders to come past. However, it's the front rider's responsibility to actually slow down and drop back. It's not the responsibility of everybody else to speed up and pass them, because then what happens is everybody doesn't speed up together. This person speeds up, and then this person speeds up, and before long, you've got a whole bunch of gaps in the group. So in order to keep it smooth, one of your responsibilities as you're pulling off is do the signaling, give a little movement of your elbow, pull off to the side, still going the same pace. Once you're clear, then you slow down and you're going to drop back. Let me move this whole group. Now, as this rider in red continues to drop back, they want to do it fairly smoothly. And this is mostly for their benefit, because if you're going really fast, what happens is you drift right past the group, and then it's a huge sprint to get back on. So instead, as they're dropping back, you want it to be nice and smooth, looking. And then this rider on the back in blue, it's their responsibility as you're riding together. It's a great practice to say, I'm last. And that lets the rider in red know, oh, I got to jump on right here. And so they can drop in real smoothly. And then the rider in green, when they're done pulling, they're going to do a little movement of the elbow. They're going to pull to the side, and that the movement of the elbow lets the rider in purple know, oh, I'm not supposed to follow the person in green. I'm supposed to let them pull off. And person in green drops back, keeping it nice and smooth. Person in red says, I'm last. Rider in green drops right in. What happens if the rider in purple doesn't signal is they might, make a slow, nice, smooth movement, but instead of them going on their own, the whole group just follows. So especially as you're getting used to doing this, it's really important that the rider on the front give a signal that says essentially, come by me when you move their elbow. Again, they're pulling off, not the rider in yellow's responsibility to accelerate. It is their responsibility to just ride the same pace, and it's the responsibility of the rider in purple to drop back to the back. So just some details about riding in the group. Regardless of your position, I gave some examples about keeping it smooth. If there's some accelerations, how do you close that gap and also pull people with you in the process? If you're going to change position, you do that real smoothly. And here, I'm going to give a real quick example. Maybe somebody accelerates. A common scenario is somebody's coming out of a corner, and maybe it's a tight corner, or people just aren't super comfortable cornering, so there's a lot of slowing down. And then as you accelerate out of the corner, there's going to be gaps. And you do that a few times and people start getting tired. So maybe the rider in red is now tired and they're going as hard as they can, but they can't get around. And maybe that gap is starting to open up and get bigger and bigger and bigger. And the rider in green says, I don't want to get stuck back here. So making it smooth, don't pull out real fast, but smooth to the side, past this rider in red. Make sure you're clear all the way. And sometimes the rider in red might even say, all clear, or it's open, and just letting the rider in green know that they can slide in front. This actually helps the rider in red because now they have a wheel to follow. So by the rider in red helping to communicate, lets the rider in green also help that person out. And they follow in on that spot. Now the rider in purple here, if they didn't follow along originally, now they've got to close the gap. But that also might be possible because if this rider starts to pull out and purple sees it at the same time, then they might actually just follow and go with. And if I'm the rider in red, that might be a little tight, but I see they're coming up and I'm like, oh, hey, sweet. I'm just going to give them space. They can slide in. And now I'm right back on a wheel. It helps everybody out. So as things start going faster in a group, people start getting pushed in terms of the intensity. You can still all work together, even though it might not be as coordinated and as organized, by keeping things smooth and essentially you help yourself and you help others out in the process. With that, I want to take a pause and for some question and answer. I know we've got a couple of Q&A things that came through. And before we dive into that, if John or Jeff, if you've got any comments on that, feel free.
Actually, I was going to take one of the questions. It's very relevant. Wayne had asked, do you always pull off into the wind? And what happens is you pull off whichever way, either the group is all pulling off, so don't change. If the wind is coming from a different way and the group is always pulling off to the left, be predictable, do that way. If you're the first guy in the train, whichever way is safest. So if there's a huge shoulder and everybody seems to be pulling off on the shoulder, like on Heinz Drive, you can rotate that way. If there's a lot of traffic, you don't want to pull off into traffic all the time, but you want to pull off whichever way is safest for the group and that everybody is used to doing. Don't want to change things up. You don't want to pull off the separate way.
If I can interject here for just a minute, I agree with Jeff, but it is important to pull off into the wind for a very efficient pace line, but this is more of an advanced This is more of an advanced maneuver, and I don't think we should be covering that pulling off into the wind in these clinics. For right now, like Jeff said, you should stick with the rotation that the pack has been doing as opposed to attempting to pull off into the wind every time, because we'll be doing shorter circuits and you'll be changing your direction of pace twice a lap, or your direction of pull twice a lap. And to keep things simpler and get into good habits, I think for right now, we are going to just pull off in one direction. And like I said, so that's something a little bit more advanced that I don't think beginner groups are quite ready for. So to be safe, right now we just pull off in the one direction.
Yeah, I think John described that well. There's so many factors that if wind was the only consideration, it's a nice idea. But oftentimes it's not, whether you're on the roads just doing a group ride or whether you're in a race doing a criterium, and things change so often. But I think probably the most helpful thing to do is communicate about it, because it might be that if everybody's talking, that might work. And if you've got somebody helping lead the group and they're saying, hey, let's move this way now because of the wind, and it's a safe scenario to do that, then it could be a great way to do it. But I wouldn't do it solely because of the wind. I would probably focus more on let's communicate about which direction we're going to pull off. And some of the reasoning behind that might be the wind, but let's do it because we communicated about it, not just because it's an unspoken thing. That's one of the, like, as John says, it's more advanced. And if you start making some of those assumptions and not communicating about it, I think you run into problems. So if you're talking openly about it, I think it becomes a whole different scenario. Yeah. So my recommendation is talk about it. And because you may come to a different conclusion in the moment based upon whatever's happening in that situation. Looking through a couple other questions that were here, and I know John and Jeff answered some of those. Somebody asked about.
I can take the one where, let's see, I don't know who sent this. Anonymous. It was marked anonymous. I tend to get dropped when I pull off. Any common mistakes lead to this scenario? And to answer that, I put down, yes, two things. First of all, don't wait until you're dead tired to pull off the front of a group. A lot of people like to go out there and they like to prove themselves, prove to everyone else how strong they are. And they like to go out and pull as hard as they can for as long as they can. Unfortunately, that scenario does happen when you do that, because now you're absolutely dead tired. When we practice pacelining, we always say that your responsibility of pulling is not done until you're on the back of the pack and rejoined into the group. Just because you pulled off the front of the group doesn't mean your job is done. You have to get back on the pack. So, knowing that, you have to leave yourself a little bit of extra energy to be able to do that, because when you pull off, the group is going to keep going, or sometimes the group might even accelerate, which is another topic that another person brought up. So when you pull off, make sure you're not dead tired when you pull off. Second thing is when you're approaching the back of the pack, say there are 10 riders, when you get 3 or 4 from the back, when you get to that 7th or 8th person, start accelerating. Don't wait until that last person comes by and then try to accelerate. No, try to accelerate when you're near the back, not at the back. That way we'll give you a little bit of time and you can accelerate more gradual and save energy doing that. And then it will make it easier to get onto that back wheel of the last person.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a key thing to remember for people. And then maybe taking the other side of the poll, is somebody's asking, as the person ahead of you pulls off, should you look or think about increasing effort? I caution people against that when you are pulling through, because what typically happens when you look to increase effort is you end up speeding up and accelerating. I'm a big fan of focusing on keeping your cadence smooth, because there is an increase in effort. So I think you need to be aware of that, but you're not looking to accelerate with that. You're looking to keep your output, your speed steady. And I think by focusing on just keeping your cadence steady, you can both monitor your speed as well as recognize that it might take a little bit more effort to keep that cadence smooth. And I found that that's a more effective way to try to respond to the increased effort from being on the front without a draft, but also not be accelerating and creating gaps behind you. So yeah, so I recommend focusing on your cadence, keeping that steady as that change happens. And also really focus on, it is not my job to pass the person who's pulling off. It is my job simply to stay and do exactly what I'm doing, and for them to slow down and drop back. Yeah, if you've got other questions, feel free. We're going to kind of do a little bit of a talk through of riding in a group. Some of these things we've done, but let's imagine for a minute that we are going for a ride, and so that we are in a pace line. And we're going to imagine it's a closed course, so we're not going to worry about any traffic and things like that. And for the sake of example, we'll even say we're just doing laps on a crit course or whatever. So there may be some questions about going through corners and things like that. But so John, Jeff, and I are rolling through on the road. Plus a couple other people are with us, so we can look at our little illustration here. In this case, I'll be in the guy in the front in yellow, and my focus is really just on trying to keep things smooth in pace as I'm leading the group. As I'm going up a hill, I'm not trying to keep exactly the same speed, mainly because that'd be a huge effort and a huge pull for me. I'm not a climber, so I want to keep it going smooth, but I recognize it's going to be slowing down. Also, as we start going up a hill, I know there's not a huge, people aren't getting as big of an advantage from drafting, and so I don't have to make a really big effort. And I talked about this before, but then as we start going downhill, I do need to make sure I ramp it up and I stay on the pedals pretty well, because everybody else behind me is getting a nice free ride. They're all just back there relaxing, while I'm on the front working really hard going down the hill, just so they're not rolling up behind me. Before I get too tired, I'm not the guy who wants to sit on the front all day. That's never been me as a racer. And I take my turn, but then I'm going to get ready to drop off. So I'm going to communicate that by moving my arm. In this case, I'm going to pull off to the left. And so I'm going to move my right arm, which just indicates they're going to come by on that side. I pull off. Now I need to slow down so that they start coming by me. And, I made a decent effort on the front. So I'm also cognizant of the fact that, I'm tired, but I got to get back on the back. Because like I said, I'm not like a super motor, and I've never been a climber. So I'm hanging on for the sprint. I don't want to get dropped. And so I'm dropped back. I'm keeping an eye on who's behind me, how far I have until I get to the back, so that I can get right in the draft immediately. It's usually I'm getting out of the saddle and making a little bit of a sprint effort to get back up to speed. But I like to do that quickly so I can stay close on the wheel and get the draft. If the group is just forming, hopefully that person in red in front of me told me they were last, just as a nice, helpful reminder. But, sometimes you get that, sometimes you don't. So I was trying to do my best to keep my eyes out. John or Jeff, who wants to be the guy in blue?
Oh, I'll be the guy in blue.
What are you thinking about, or what's going through your head as we're riding?
So I'm seeing that you're getting a little bit tired. I can tell by how your body's looking, because I'm looking through you, looking to see what's going on up ahead. So I want to see if there's, a curve up ahead, or if there's, maybe somebody got away and there's somebody else riding up there. And I want to see what's going on ahead of you, and not staring at your cassette and see what gear you're in, because sometimes you want to know how hard he's going. But I can see that you're getting tired, and I see your elbow flick. So I'm just going to keep my pace the same, because if we're all together, I want to keep it that way, and just pull through nice and steady, going right through as you're going by, and maybe saying, good job, because that's always nice. Let the first guy know that he's doing a good job. And I'm going to take maybe a minute pull, not too long, not too short. I don't want to tire myself out. I want to keep this little pace line going. So I'm going to flick off after a minute with plenty of energy left in me, so the next guy can take over some of their effort. I'm not trying to be a hero, so I'm just going to pull right off and let the next guy do his job, and maybe we can just keep this moving.
Now, John, you're one of these other guys in the group, maybe purple or red, sitting toward the back. What are you thinking about? What are you focusing on as we're riding?
Well, I'm always looking forward. I'm always looking through the group. So being that there's only 5 people here in the group, I'm actually able to watch the front guy. So my eyes on, up the road, and I can see that person flicks their elbow and they want to get off the front. But my concentration is still on keeping my place in line, in the pace line, and trying to keep steady and smooth and following the line of riders. My job isn't as important as the first or second rider in the group at this point, but I am still protecting my front wheel, doing the safe things, and just keeping the pace line. I do want to clarify the flick of the elbow. I know we've been using that, Lucas has been using that term, and what that is, as riders, we flick our elbow, and it's kind of like our way of waving our hand, and you want to wave somebody through and say, hey, come on through. But we flick our elbow because we don't want to take our hands off the handlebars. That's important not to take our hand off the handlebars, because you lose control of one of the brakes, one of your brake levers. And it's always very important to keep your hands on those brake levers at all times, or be able to access them. So that's the reason why we don't take our hands off, and that's the reason why we just flick our elbow instead of taking our hands off and waving people through. We actually just flick our elbows, and that's what that's meant by.
Now, John, to throw you for a loop, what if you're sitting a little further back and the rider in green starts letting a gap open? What are the sorts of things going through your head, or what are you trying to do?
Well, my thoughts are, that rider in green is probably not the best of riders, because they're letting a gap open. So that throws up a red flag to me right away that that's not a person that I want to follow all the time. Second thing is that I'm going to want to get around that person, in this case, if I'm the red rider, I'm going to want to get around those 2 in front of me as quickly as possible. The reason for that is so I can keep my place near the front of the group, as opposed to getting dropped by the group and then having to sprint a long way to get back to the group later. The longer you wait, the harder it's going to be to get back with the group.
Yeah, and I heard you say something in there. You were making an assessment of that rider in green, not just for that moment, but also moving forward. So say,
Yes, I am judging.
Right. And I was pointing out that you're being judgmental, because I think that's actually good. I talk about perspective, and we talk about always looking up the road, but a lot of that is anticipating what might happen. And, John's saying, I've just made an assessment of the rider in green that is not a good rider to be behind. And so the group may come back together, but John's probably not going to be trying to find himself behind that rider at any point. because that gap is likely to open again in a similar situation, and you don't want to put yourself in that position more than once.
And I might, if that rider I think is strong enough, I might want to say something to him or to them as I go by, something like, "Hey, let's try to keep the group together and not open up gaps like that." Maybe if they're doing something that it is unsafe, I might want to say something to them. I won't yell at them, but I will try to, if they don't. If they're doing it for no reason and I feel that they are squirrely, I'm going to, like you said, avoid them later on in the race or in the ride. Now, there might be reasons for that. The rider in green that opened up the gap, they might be having a drink and they can't drink very well and ride at the same time. They might be having a snack. If they're looking at their cell phone, I will say something to them. If they're doing something stupid like that, I will say something to them. But yeah, that kind of throws up a red flag. And yes, I will watch that person a little bit more carefully going forward.
I'm jumping over. We'll do a little bit more Q&A, but one of the things we do when we're in person is we do a practice race, and that can be good because it's pretty low key, but we go through some details of that. So I thought we'd just take a second to talk about that, and then I know we've got at least one more other question there, and we may have a few other things we want to share. But in the context of doing a race, or especially just keep in mind more practice races as you're learning, is pinning on a number on a jersey. And we've got a picture here of some good and some essentially progressively not good jersey pinning practices. The one tip I always give people is just use 8 pins. That means 1 pin in each corner and 1 pin in the middle, because it keeps the number nice and flat. The wind doesn't catch it. It doesn't act like a sail or flap when you're riding. Some people are trying to rub their numbers and make them softer. If you just use 8 pins, it takes a little longer with the pinning, but everything stays nice and flat. And then you want to position it well so that it can be seen usually from the side, because that's where the official is going to be located. If you're at a race with a camera overhead, sometimes you might have it just a little bit higher, like the person at the upper right here of our examples. But the example at the bottom right, the camera might be able to see it, but the official can't see it. If you watch the Tour de France, they all have numbers on their pockets. Only at the Tour do they do that. No other bike races does that work very well. So those are some quick tips on pinning a number. John, as an official, you know all about the start line procedures. What are some things that we often talk about when you're pulling up to the start line of a race?
I do. I would like to talk on this, and you are very correct. The number on the rider number 111 has a good placement, but probably not the best. I prefer rider 129 or the second rider. I think that's a 129 or 125. I can't read that last number from this position. That way, usually the camera is a little bit elevated. They try to have the cameras a little bit elevated, yet you still can read it from the side as an official. As far as crinkling the numbers, you don't do that because of the reflection of the camera that affects the reflection of the camera, and it's harder to read through the camera lens. That's the reason why we don't crinkle the numbers. And yeah, the last 2 riders, rider 127, and I can't even see the last rider in red. Those are definitely bad placements. Like I said, I prefer, as an official, I prefer rider number 2's pin placement, or bib number placement.
Yeah.
Just to add on to that, definitely don't ever use the holes. The holes are not to be used for pinning.
They're not. We don't know why they're there. No one who actually knows how to pin on a race number or has experience doing it a lot knows why the holes are there. Yeah, like Jeff said, don't use the holes.
Yeah, I actually have a pinned number jersey on right now if you want to show it. I don't know how that...
that might be a trick. Are you in camera?
That might be a trick.
Now, a caveat to that, Lucas did say that we don't wear numbers on our back. That's not entirely true. We don't wear numbers on our backs in criteriums. In the state of Michigan, we require 2 bib numbers on road races only. 1 on the side for the camera at the finish line, and then 1 in the back, like they do at the Tour de France, so that the following officials can view it. Because in most or in road races, your official will be behind you in a vehicle of some kind. So they need to be able to view it. So when an official's in a car behind you, they can't read the number on the side. When you're going by the finish line, they can't read the number behind. They can only read the number on the side. That's how come we have 2 numbers when we're doing road races.
Here, Jeff, I was going to see real quick. Well, Jeff, I don't know how to make your video work. So sorry about that.
Oh,
we
that's
did a
fine.
test right before this, and we had no problem having all those videos show. I'm not sure what is
Yeah,
different on
I
this.
think you may have to show everyone. I don't know if there's an option to show just one.
Oh, here
I
we
know
go.
when I tried to show mine, it said that
Oh,
there
yes.
you go. Well, you got me.
There we go. I found it.
All right.
Here we
Let's
go.
see.
Sorry. There, he's all pinned up and ready to go.
Oh, and it's upside down, but that's because I didn't pay attention and...
No, you're right side up from me. You're
It
good.
looks correct to us.
Oh, wait a minute. See, to me,
337?
your pinning is a little bit high because right now I can't read the top numbers. Now, I don't know if the pinning's high or the camera's low. That could be.
That's probably both.
We gotta work in camera position.
Yeah.
See, it's
that's
right above my line.
Yes.
Yep.
Now,
Generally,
you'll also notice that his number is on the opposite side of the riders in the pictures on Lucas's PowerPoint. This is something also important to note is which side the camera is on or which side the officials are on, because you will only get one number and you pin it on the right or left side. Generally, they will tell you at registration when you go to pick up your bib numbers which side your number should be on. If not, just ask one of the officials and they'll let you know.
Yeah, and if you don't ask, you put it on the wrong side. It takes a good couple of minutes and you probably put your number on upside down on the other side.
Yes. A helpful tip for putting your jersey number on, either have a friend do it while you have your jersey on, or stretch it over your steering wheel. I like to put my jersey right on the steering wheel of my car. I put it on there so it stretches it out nice, and it gives me a nice little area to pin it on, and it helps me get my number nice and flat.
Now, John, as you have riders roll up to the start line at a race, what are some of the announcements? What are some of the things you want to make sure that riders know at the beginning of a race?
Well, first of all, I'll introduce myself. I'll welcome them to the race, and then I will let them know what race this is. The reason I do that is I have had riders come up and they're in the wrong race. And so they might come up and, be in the Cat 3 race when they actually should be in the Cat 4 race that starts a half hour later. Or hopefully not half hour earlier. Other things, I will let them know how long the race is. Before a race, I will let everyone know how long it is, what the prize money is, and how deep they are paying. I'll also point out things like road hazards, point out where first aid is located if needed. Hopefully we won't need those. I'll also point out where the wheel pit is located in a criterium. I might point out other things in a road race that they'll have an official following them if they have a lead vehicle or not. I'll also point out other rules that you can't go backwards on a course, on a crit course, in order to get to the pit area. That you can cut the course, but not go backwards on the course for safety reasons. I'll look around and make sure everybody has a helmet on. Helmets are very important at all times. I will, expanding on that, according to USA cycling rules, you must have a helmet on at all times while you are on a bike, except for if you are on a trainer just warming up before a race. So even if you are riding to the Porta-John or you're riding to registration and you're on your bike, you must have that helmet on. Most of the times I will, if I do see somebody without a helmet, I'll blow my whistle and I'll give them a little tap on the head, telling them, hey, get a helmet on or walk your bike. Let's see, other things that I might go through. I don't have my start list in front of me. I might tell them afterwards where the podium is and how long before we will be doing that, where they can check results after the race. And that's about it. And then I will tell them to have a safe race and push them on their way. Any preems, I'll also announce any preems, and the last lap will be announced by a bell. And we'll usually have a bell there, and we'll also have lap cards for laps remaining in the race.
And sometimes we count up in time, while sometimes we do it by time and laps. How does that work?
Yes. Okay. That is a good question. So we've found out through the years of racing that we only have a course for a limited amount of time, especially when it comes to downtown city areas. So in order to keep races running on time, we found it easier to run them by time as opposed to running by laps. Because a race can run much longer or shorter if you run by a number of laps, depending on how fast how fast a pack is going during any one given race. And that can vary a lot from field to field because you have different abilities, and also you can have different weather conditions. Different weather conditions can slow up or slow a race down. Because if rain moves in, it will slow race down. So what we do is, for example, if there's a 1 kilometer long course that we're running a criterium on, and that race is 45 minutes. What we will do as an official, we will start timing the laps of the riders. Once we get into a comfortable pattern to where we see that they're doing that kilometer in 1 minute 50 seconds, we will start calculating that out with the time remaining, and then we will move over to laps. So that way we're pretty close. We will follow pretty close to 45 minutes of racing time. But then when you go over to laps, at least that way it allows the riders to know how many laps they have left in the race so they can plan out their strategies. So that's the reason that we do a time/lap combination.
Excellent. And then a couple other things we always encourage people when are doing our practice races is try and actually ride with others. So if you're super strong, don't ride away from everybody. Actually practice riding with other people. If you're struggling to keep up with maybe the main group, there's always other riders that are behind as well, trying to work together and actually practice riding with each other. You know, you can go ride on your own anytime, but when you get the opportunity to ride in a group or especially do a practice race or a real race, really try and practice riding with others. I think one of the people was earlier had asked a question about getting dropped in certain situations, and try and learn from those and not do the same thing twice, hopefully. But every year I see some riders who are plenty strong, definitely fast enough to keep up with the group, but it's just a matter of getting used to how do you stay in the draft? How do you get comfortable riding with the group? How do you go around corners and maintain speed without letting a big gap open? And once they get those things, then they stay with the group, no problem. So normally if we're doing the in-person beginning racer program, it's 5 weeks. And I've seen a number of racers who they show up in the first couple of weeks are really struggling. And I can tell when we're just doing some of the basic drills, they're plenty strong. But with that practice, they get to the point where they're able to stay with the group the whole time by the end of the series. And it's just a matter of practice riding with other people, doing the drills, you know, trying to correct things that they're struggling with at first. And by the end, they're doing some of those skills correctly. And now they stay with the group really easily. So it definitely is a matter of just practicing, taking advantage of those opportunities to ride with other people. With practice races, with group rides, try and remember, be safe, have fun. It can be competitive. You can push yourself. But if you're ever in a situation that's dangerous, kind of recognize that. Feel free to kind of back off, leave more space, or say, you know, maybe not right now. You come into the sprint and things are getting a little crazy. Just remember, stay safe. We always tell people at the practice races, you know, you don't get anything for winning. So everybody gets the same experience. So try and just keep it safe. And the last one that we inevitably happens if we don't say something is at the end of the race, keep going past the finish line. Don't stop. So some people get, you know, have this, you know, I finished, I'm done. And they stop right after the finish line, but there's lots more people coming usually. So continue through, go, you know, past quite a distance, and then slowly slow down, get out of the way, things like that. Watch for who's coming. But never stop right at the finish line, because otherwise that creates hazards for other people coming through. I know we had one more question in our Q&A, and so let me see if I can't bring that back up. But somebody was asking about drafting and pulling in the perspective of racing, and you know what's different, or how do these things apply? Same thing. These are kind of the simplified version of what happens in racing. And it's interesting when we do our beginning racer program in person, the first week or two, the race looks super organized. It usually looks like just a really big pace line because everybody's kind of learning and understanding how to ride together. And so you just kind of all do the basics. And then as we get a little bit more advanced in how to move through the group and things like that, and then it gets a little bit more, it looks more like some of the more advanced categories. Not quite like an organized pace line, but more like a pack. People start to understand how to move in the group and are a little bit more comfortable riding that way as opposed to in a really organized pace line. But the same principles apply in terms of, you know, following the rider in front of you. If we're riding too wide in a group, well, here we go. If we're riding too wide, the same thing happens. Rider in blue here is just following the rider in front of them, and the rider in green is following the rider in front of them. So nothing really changes from that standpoint. You have to be a little bit aware of the space between you. You don't want to open up too much, because then you can have riders sliding in, and we'll talk more about this next week. So it doesn't protect your space at all. And this is when we start talking a little bit more about being assertive versus passive or aggressive. But, you know, green rider's just following the purple rider in front and is mindful of the people next to them. But so the same things really apply. In terms of what happens at the beginning of a crit, the first couple of laps, anticipate that the first couple of laps of a race are the fastest and the hardest. And if that's a point when you're always having a difficult time staying in contact, find a wheel that you trust or somebody that looks like they can stay there, and just follow the wheel. There is no need to be pulling on the front unless you feel like you're strong enough to pull on the front. The other thing is, if we go back to the kind of or the chalkboard here, for lack of a better word, is that we want to make sure that if I'm the rider in green, sitting at the very back is not the best place to be, because that means anytime somebody else ahead of me gets gapped off, I'm also gapped off. So one of the things I recommend is, if you're worried about what's going to happen at the start of the race, kind of like fake it till you make it. Put yourself in position that you want to be in, not necessarily that you feel like you've earned. There's a number of people every year as we do some of these things who are like, well, I don't deserve to be at the front. Just go to the front. Don't worry about who deserves to be there. Just go to the front. And with that in mind, sometimes the race starts at the start line. I remember when I was little and I was just learning, and I could get to the finish of a race if I started with good position. And so I would just make sure I was at the front of the group when the race started, so that I wasn't having to work my way up through the group. I could just kind of be in there and did my best to stay in the middle of the group and not get too far back. So start at the front. If you're having a hard time, follow wheels, start at the front, set yourself up in multiple different ways to hang on, rather than saying, well, I'm probably going to be at the back, I better start at the back. Try not to do that, because it doesn't set yourself up very well.
If I could interject to that point, what we've gone through, what Lucas has gone through for most of the day at pace lining, this is for a nice friendly pace line. So you start out, Yellow would start out at the front, and when he pulls off, or when that rider pulls off, they would pull all the way to the back. That's not necessarily true with racing. When you're getting into racing, now you're trying to, like Lucas said, you're trying to keep your position. You don't necessarily want to be on the front all the time, but you may want to stay near the front. So if you find yourself being dropped, you might not want to go back behind Purple, because Purple might be already tired, because Purple is already at the back of the pack. So if Purple and Red do open up a gap like that, fill it in. Stay near the front. If you can drop back, ideally in a criterium, if you can get on the front and you can drop back 10 places instead of dropping back to the 30th or 40th place at the end of the field, you want to fill into that top 10 spot. That way you stay near the front, yet you're still getting draft.
And that is we can describe it, but I know that's one of those things that takes some experience to do, because every year we'll see somebody pull off the front and they'll be looking back, dropping back 15, 20, 25 riders, waiting to get back in. And it takes a little bit of nuance, but you can kind of make a spot, usually you drift back, 8 or 10 riders, and you might say, hey, this is far enough. And just ask. You can say, hey, can I get in here? And lots of times somebody will just open up a gap, because, if you want to get in and do some work, they're often happy to let you in, and then just follow your wheel. They're no closer to the front. They're no closer to having to do any work. You get to stay in a better position. They don't have to do anything more. I know we've hit all of the question and answer things. If anybody have any last questions you want to chime in, feel free to unmute yourself or drop something in the Q&A real fast. I'll hang out for a minute and see if we have any of those. But next week we will be talking a little bit more in depth about riding in a bigger group. So, we introduced a lot of the basics. And next week we will start applying that to cornering. So we'll talk about cornering in a group, sprinting, what does that look like in a group, and then navigating through a field. Today at the end, we're just talking a little bit about, settling back in as you drop off the front. But sometimes you're going to move up through the group. How do you advance within the field? and some more concepts that'll apply, especially to race situations, but that are also just kind of good to keep in mind if you're riding in a group. So thank you very much for joining us, and hope this is helpful. If you've got more questions that come up, feel free to reach out. I think some of the Ann Arbor Velo Club members are here, and feel free to contact us through club stuff, or at least contact me through club channels. But also feel free to get in touch if you've got other questions about cycling. Next Saturday at the same time, we'll be doing that second session. And as soon as we have this video posted, we'll share that online so that you can see that and share with other people, and catch anybody up before next week's session if they're going to join us live next week. Thanks very much. And thank you, John and Jeff, for joining us. Look forward to having you again next week.